The laundry was still tumbling when Rachel Morrison disappeared from her locked second-floor apartment in Sturgis, Michigan, on the morning of March the 17th, 2001. The dryer's mechanical rhythm echoed through the empty hallway while her nursing textbooks lay spread across the dining table, yellow highlighter still uncapped beside a half-completed pharmacology assignment. Her turkey sandwich sat abandoned on the kitchen counter, 3 bites taken, the bread beginning to curl at the edges. The radio continued playing its cheerful weekend weather forecast, as if nothing had changed, as if a 24-year-old woman hadn't simply vanished from a space sealed tighter than a bank vault. But here's what makes this story absolutely devastating. Rachel was just 8 weeks away from graduation, 8 weeks from becoming the pediatric nurse she'd dreamed of being since childhood. Her refrigerator displayed those perfect color-coded study schedules that only the most dedicated students create. Green ink for clinical rotations at Sturgis Hospital, blue for exam dates, red for her standing Sunday dinners with her parents, a tradition she'd never missed, not once, in the 3 years since moving into that Monroe Street apartment above Henderson's hardware store. Before we dive deeper into this impossible mystery that would haunt a small Michigan community for nearly 2 decades, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it at your location? Drop it in the comments below. I love connecting with viewers from around the world who are fascinated by these unsolved mysteries, just like I am. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because we cover cases that will keep you questioning everything you thought you knew about safety and trust. Now think about your own routines for a moment. Your morning coffee ritual, your evening wind down, those predictable patterns that make you feel secure in an unpredictable world. Rachel Morrison lived by those same comforting routines. She called her mother Patricia every Friday afternoon from the hospital break room. She picked up Diet Coke and a movie from Blockbuster for quiet weekend nights. She waved to her downstairs neighbor Bill Henderson when she climbed those creaking wooden stairs to her apartment. What happened in the hours between 11:30 p.m. on Friday, March 16th, and 7 a.m. on Saturday, March 17th, 2001, would shatter every assumption this farming community held about safety, about trust, and about the thin line separating ordinary life from inexplicable horror. The truth, when it finally emerged 19 years later, would reveal that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones wearing the uniforms we trust most. Rachel Morrison wasn't just another college student counting down the days until graduation. At 24, she'd already overcome obstacles that would have derailed most people her age. She'd worked 2 jobs throughout nursing school, waitressing at the truck stop outside town during weekends, picking up shifts wherever the hospital needed extra help during the week. Her Ford Escort had 180,000 miles on it, held together by determination and prayer, but she'd never missed a clinical rotation or study group because of it. Her apartment reflected the methodical mind of someone who'd learned to organize every aspect of life around achieving a single, focused goal. Medical textbooks arranged alphabetically on makeshift shelves built from cinder blocks and wooden planks. Clinical rotation schedules taped to the refrigerator door. A coffee can labeled Graduation Fund sitting on the kitchen counter, filled with crumpled bills and loose change saved from tips and part-time paychecks. Patricia Morrison had watched her daughter transform from a dreamy teenager into this laser-focused young woman, and she couldn't have been prouder. Every Friday afternoon at exactly 4:30 p.m., Rachel would call from the hospital break room between patient rounds. It was their sacred time, those 15 minutes when Patricia could hear the exhaustion mixed with excitement in her daughter's voice, as she talked about her patients, her classes, her plans for the future. That final Friday conversation, March the 16th, followed the same comfortable pattern it had for months. Rachel complained about her pharmacology professor, who seemed determined to fail half the class. She mentioned a difficult patient in pediatrics who reminded her why she wanted to specialize in working with children. She talked about the upcoming finals that would determine whether she graduated with honors. "Mom, I can practically taste that graduation ceremony," Rachel had said, her voice bright despite the fatigue Patricia could detect underneath. "8 more weeks and I'll be Rachel Morrison, RN. Can you believe it?" Patricia had laughed, that mixture of maternal pride and relief that comes when you watch your child succeed despite the odds. "I've believed it since you were 12 years old and insisted on bandaging every injured bird we found in the backyard." They'd talked about weekend plans, studying, laundry, maybe renting a movie from Blockbuster if Rachel felt caught up enough to take a break. Patricia had reminded her daughter to eat something besides vending machine sandwiches and instant coffee. Rachel had promised to call Sunday morning before heading to her parents' house for their traditional dinner. "I love you, sweetheart," Patricia had said, the same words that ended every conversation. "Love you too, Mom. See you Sunday." Those would be the last words Patricia Morrison ever heard her daughter speak. Bill Henderson, the hardware store owner's nephew who managed the shop and lived in the apartment next to the building, provided the final confirmed sighting of Rachel Morrison. At 10:47 p.m., he'd been locking up the store's back entrance when she walked past, returning from Blockbuster with a romantic comedy starring Julia Roberts and a 2-liter bottle of Diet Coke. Bill had known Rachel for 3 years, ever since she'd rented the upstairs apartment. She always waved, always smiled, always seemed genuinely pleased to see him. That Friday night was no different. She'd climbed those wooden stairs, her white sneakers making familiar creaking sounds on each step. He'd watched her reach the landing, heard her key turn in the lock, seen her kitchen light come on through the window. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing that suggested he'd just witnessed the last few seconds of a young woman's normal life. Have you ever had a routine so comforting, so predictable, that it made you feel completely safe in the world? Drop a comment below and let me know, because sometimes it's those very routines that make us most vulnerable to the people who study our patterns and wait for the perfect moment to strike. What happened in those next hours would haunt Sturgis, Michigan, for the next 20 years. Patricia Morrison arrived at her daughter's apartment at 7:15 a.m. on Saturday morning, carrying a carton of fresh eggs from the family farm and looking forward to their weekly breakfast tradition. She climbed those familiar wooden stairs, knocked on the door, and waited for Rachel's sleepy voice to call out, "Coming, Mom." But silence greeted her instead. Patricia knocked again, harder this time, pressing her ear to the door. No footsteps, no movement, no sound except the mechanical hum of the dryer running somewhere inside the apartment. A cold knot formed in her stomach as she fumbled for the spare key Rachel had given her months earlier, the one she'd never actually used because Rachel was always awake and ready when she arrived. The key turned easily in the lock, but when Patricia pushed the door open, it stopped abruptly after just a few inches. The security chain was engaged from the inside. Through the narrow gap, she could see into the living room. Everything appeared normal, undisturbed. But where was Rachel? "Rachel, honey, are you okay?" Patricia called through the opening, her voice already edged with panic. Nothing. Patricia ran downstairs to find Bill Henderson, who was opening the hardware store for the Saturday morning rush. Together, they managed to force the chain lock by pushing hard enough to bend the flimsy metal bracket holding it to the door frame. The chain clattered to the floor as they stumbled into the apartment, calling Rachel's name. What they found defied every logical explanation. The apartment was locked from the inside, not just the front door with its deadbolt engaged, but the security chain as well. Every window was latched shut from the interior. The single-bedroom window had been painted closed years earlier, according to the landlord. The bathroom window was barely large enough for a child to squeeze through, and it too remained locked from inside. Deputy Wallace from the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department arrived within 20 minutes, his digital camera clicking methodically as he documented each impossible detail. Rachel's purse sat undisturbed on the dining table, her wallet containing her driver's license, $43 in cash, and her hospital ID badge. Her car keys lay beside the purse. Her white Ford Escort remained parked in its designated spot behind the building. The rented movie from Blockbuster, that Julia Roberts' romantic comedy, sat unopened on the coffee table next to the unopened 2-liter of Diet Coke, condensation still beating on the plastic bottle. The turkey sandwich on the kitchen counter showed 3 distinct bite marks, the bread edges curling slightly with age. But most puzzling of all was the laundry. The dryer was still running when they entered, tumbling Rachel's work scrubs and casual clothes in endless circles. Based on the timer mechanism, the cycle had finished around 1:30 a.m., meaning the machine had been running empty for nearly 6 hours. The clothes long since, dry and now wrinkled from the continuous motion. "It doesn't make sense," Deputy Wallace told his supervisor over the radio, standing in Rachel's small kitchen where cabinet doors remained open, where a coffee mug sat soaking in the sink, where everything spoke of a life interrupted mid-moment. "There's no way in or out. She locked herself in here, and then she just wasn't here anymore." Sheriff Tom Brady, a 30-year veteran who'd worked everything from farm accidents to domestic violence, spent 20 minutes walking through that apartment, testing every lock, examining every window, running his hands along the walls as if searching for secret passages that didn't exist. He found nothing, no explanation, no mechanism, no logic, just the stubborn, impossible fact of a young woman erased from a sealed space. How does someone simply vanish from a locked room? How does a person disappear from an apartment sealed tighter than a bank vault, leaving behind every personal possession, every sign of normal life, every indication that they'd been there just hours before? The answer would take 19 years to uncover. Detective Marcus Hayes was assigned as primary investigator within hours of Patricia Morrison's 911 call. At 38, Hayes was a 15-year veteran of the Michigan State Police who'd transferred to the Paw Paw post 6 months earlier, seeking quieter work after years battling gang violence and drug trafficking in Flint. He was methodical, patient, known for building rapport with witnesses, traits that would be tested in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Hayes understood the mathematics of missing persons cases. The first 48 hours were everything. After that, the chances of finding someone alive dropped exponentially, so he worked those crucial hours without sleep, his notebook filling with witness statements, timeline reconstructions, and increasingly desperate theories about how a person could disappear from a locked apartment. He interviewed Bill Henderson 6 times that first weekend. The story never changed. He'd seen Rachel enter her apartment, heard the door lock, watched her kitchen light come on, driven away. Everything normal, everything routine. Henderson had heard nothing unusual, seen no unfamiliar vehicles in the area, noticed no shadows moving across Rachel's windows. The neighboring tenants provided equally frustrating testimony. The couple 2 doors down had been watching late-night television, heard nothing suspicious. The elderly woman across Monroe Street had been asleep since 10 p.m. College students in the house behind Henderson's hardware had thrown a small party, but their attention was focused inward on beer and conversation, not on the woman vanishing silently from her locked apartment. Crime scene technicians found Rachel's fingerprints throughout the apartment. Bill Henderson's prints on surfaces from previous visits, helping her move furniture. The landlord's prints in expected locations. Patricia Morrison's prints on the spare key. But no unidentified prints, no signs of forced entry, no biological evidence suggesting violence or struggle. Within days, the community began fracturing along predictable lines. At Rosie's Family Restaurant on West Chicago Road, the morning coffee crowd that had gathered religiously for years suddenly found themselves choosing sides. Some whispered that Rachel must have staged her own disappearance. The pressure of nursing school, the weight of her parents' expectations, the grinding exhaustion of working multiple jobs while maintaining perfect grades. Maybe she'd simply snapped, they suggested, staging the locked room mystery to buy herself time to escape and start over somewhere nobody knew her story. But others pointed out the obvious flaws in that theory. Why would someone planning to disappear leave behind her car, her money, her nursing textbooks representing thousands of dollars of investment? Why abandon everything weeks before graduation when the finish line was finally visible? The boyfriend theory gained traction despite the complete absence of a boyfriend. Rachel's classmates, from nursing school, her co-workers at the hospital, the regular customers from her waitressing days at the truck stop. Everyone painted the same picture of a young woman focused almost exclusively on her studies. Pleasant, friendly, but not romantically involved. No dating relationships, no secret admirers, no complicated emotional entanglements. Hayes explored every hospital connection with methodical thoroughness. Nurses encountered difficult patients sometimes, people in crisis, people with mental illness or addiction issues, people capable of violence. He interviewed security personnel, pulled records of any incidents involving aggressive patients or threatening behavior. The trail led nowhere. Rachel had worked her clinical rotations without incident, earning praise from supervisors and genuine affection from the pediatric patients she hoped to work with after graduation. Meanwhile, the Morrison family was disintegrating under the weight of not knowing. Patricia transformed Rachel's childhood bedroom into a command center, covering the walls with maps and timelines and photographs. She maintained a thick binder containing every news article, every tip, every scrap of information related to her daughter's disappearance. She called the sheriff's department daily, her voice a mixture of hope and desperation that made deputies uncomfortable, made them feel the weight of their failure every time they heard her ask, "Any updates today?" Robert Morrison retreated in the opposite direction, his grief turning inward, hardening into something cold and protective. He spent longer hours at his agricultural equipment repair business, speaking less as the weeks accumulated into months. While Patricia's pain radiated outward, demanding attention and action, Robert's anguish became a black hole that swallowed conversations and family dinners and any attempt at normal interaction. The contrast was devastating to watch, One parent consumed by the need to do something, anything, to find their daughter, while the other parent slowly disappeared into his own private hell of helplessness and guilt. What theory would you have developed if you'd been investigating this case? A staged disappearance? A secret relationship gone wrong? Something connected to her hospital work? Share your thoughts in the comments, because the truth, when it finally emerged 19 years later, was more shocking than any theory the community had imagined. The case was about to go cold, but it would never truly die. Sturgis, Michigan, in 2001, was a community of approximately 11,000 people straddling the Indiana border in the southwestern corner of the state. This was a place where agriculture and small manufacturing provided steady employment, where 3 generations of families farmed the same land, where high school football games drew crowds on Friday nights, and everybody knew everybody else's business, for better and for worse. It was the kind of town that prided itself on being safe, wholesome, a good place to raise children. Doors could be left unlocked. Neighbors looked after one another. Terrible things happened elsewhere, in Detroit, Chicago, some other distant urban landscape. Not here. Never here. Rachel Morrison's disappearance shattered that carefully maintained illusion like glass hitting concrete. Within weeks, the questions multiplied at every social gathering. At St. John's Catholic Church, where Rachel's family had worshipped for 3 generations, parishioners lingered after Sunday service, their conversations heavy with speculation. At the Sturgis Public Library, elderly volunteers checking out books shared theories alongside the latest gossip. The questions grew and fed on themselves, spreading through the community like a virus nobody could contain. The hardware store below Rachel's apartment became an unwitting shrine. Customers who'd never paid attention to the upstairs apartment now found excuses to peer up at those windows, to ask Bill Henderson if he'd remembered anything new, if the police had discovered any clues. Henderson grew tired of the attention, tired of repeating his story, tired of seeing the mixture of curiosity and suspicion in his neighbors' eyes. Search parties formed organically those first few weeks. Dozens of volunteers combed through farmland and wooded areas throughout St. Joseph County, their voices calling Rachel's name across empty fields, their flashlights cutting through the darkness of early spring nights. Church groups organized food for the searchers. Local businesses donated supplies. The community rallied in the way small towns always do when faced with tragedy. But as March melted into April, then May, the volunteers dwindled. Real life reasserted itself. Jobs, families, responsibilities that couldn't be postponed indefinitely for a search that yielded nothing but false hope and tired feet. The false leads multiplied faster than anyone could process them. A convenience store clerk in nearby Coldwater reported serving a young blonde woman who seemed nervous, checking over her shoulder while counting exact change. A truck driver thought he'd given a ride to someone matching Rachel's description, heading east toward Detroit. A caller to the sheriff's tip line claimed Rachel was living with a religious group in northern Michigan, but the caller had a history of unreliable reports. Each lead required investigation. Each investigation consumed precious resources. Detective Hayes drove hundreds of miles, chasing shadows, interviewing people who ultimately had nothing to do with Rachel's disappearance. The department's limited budget strained under the weight of overtime hours and travel expenses. Meanwhile, forensic evidence sat waiting in the Michigan State Police Laboratory in Lansing. Fiber samples collected from Rachel's jacket had yielded a partial DNA profile. 8 genetic markers instead of the 13 required for database comparison. The sample was classified as insufficient, noted as potentially degraded, then carefully preserved in frozen storage alongside thousands of other evidence samples waiting for technology that didn't yet exist. In 2001, the combined DNA index system contained fewer than 1 million profiles, mostly convicted offenders from violent crimes. Without a suspect to compare against, the partial profile was simply data points stored in a computer, meaningless until science could advance enough to unlock their secrets. By March 17, 2002, exactly 1 year after Rachel's disappearance, the case had quietly transitioned from active investigation to cold case status. Detective Hayes assured Patricia Morrison that any new evidence would receive immediate attention, but everyone involved understood the hollow ring of that promise. Cold cases in rural Michigan often stayed cold forever, buried beneath accumulating paperwork and newer emergencies that demanded immediate attention. The search for Rachel Morrison was over. The waiting had begun. 18 years passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Patricia Morrison never stopped searching. She transformed Rachel's childhood bedroom into something between a shrine and a war room, covering every inch of wall space with maps of Michigan, timeline charts marking significant dates, and photographs of her daughter at every age. The bed disappeared under boxes of files containing police reports, witness statements, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. She maintained a thick binder that grew heavier each year, filled with newspaper clippings, tip-line reports, and printouts from early internet crime forums where she'd post Rachel's information, hoping someone, somewhere, might recognize her daughter's face. Patricia called the sheriff's department every Monday morning at precisely 9 a.m., her voice maintaining the same careful politeness, even as hope slowly drained from her words. "Any updates this week, Detective Hayes?" she would ask, though she already knew the answer. Robert Morrison chose a different path through grief. While his wife channeled her anguish into action, he withdrew deeper into himself with each passing month. He spent longer hours at his equipment repair shop, taking on jobs he didn't need, working until exhaustion made sleep possible. At family gatherings, the few they still attended, Robert would sit quietly at the edge of conversations, his presence a reminder of the empty chair that should have been filled by his daughter. Their marriage survived, but barely. Two people drowning in the same ocean, unable to reach each other across the vast distance their different grieving styles had created. Detective Hayes carried the case with him through his remaining years with the Michigan State Police. He would pull Rachel's file from the storage boxes late at night when other cases were resolved, spreading the crime scene photographs across his desk, studying witness statements until the words blurred together. The locked apartment on Monroe Street haunted his dreams. That impossible scene mocking every investigative technique he'd learned over 2 decades of police work. When Hayes retired in 2016 at age 53, he moved to a small house on Lake Michigan, where he tried not to think about unsolved cases. But Rachel Morrison's photograph remained on his desk. A young woman in nursing scrubs, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed her future was secure. Meanwhile, Sturgis gradually returned to its normal rhythms, the way communities always do after tragedy. The initial shock faded into background noise. Rachel's missing person flyers yellowed on telephone poles, then disappeared entirely. Her case was mentioned occasionally at town council meetings or in anniversary articles in the local newspaper, but increasingly it was treated as a mystery from the past rather than an urgent present crisis. The apartment above Henderson's hardware store changed tenants multiple times. None stayed long. Whether because of the history or simply the transient nature of rental housing, nobody could say for certain. Bill Henderson grew tired of explaining the story to each new renter, tired of the way people looked at him when they learned about that night in March 2001. False sightings continued sporadically throughout the years. A hospital worker in Grand Rapids thought she recognized Rachel in the emergency room waiting area. A gas station attendant in Traverse City was certain he'd seen her buying coffee and cigarettes, though Rachel had never smoked. Each report required follow-up. Each investigation led nowhere. Each dead end added another layer of frustration to a case that seemed designed to resist solution. The weight of the unsolved mystery settled over everyone who'd been touched by it like dust that could never be completely cleaned away. Patricia Morrison aged decades in the span of a few years. Robert Morrison's hair went completely gray by his 50th birthday. Detective Hayes developed insomnia that would plague him well into retirement. But somewhere in frozen storage at the Michigan State Police Laboratory, fiber samples waited patiently for technology to catch up with justice. Science was advancing rapidly in the early 2000s, though none of them knew that salvation was already in motion. In April 2020, while the world grappled with a global pandemic that had shut down normal life, the Michigan State Police quietly established something that would change everything for families like the Morrisons. The Cold Case Unit, operating in partnership with Michigan State University, represented a new approach to justice, victim-centered, offender-focused, designed to bring closure to families who'd waited years for answers. Detective Sergeant Larry Rothman was assigned to lead this revolutionary program. At 45, Rothman had spent 2 decades working major crimes across the state, but he understood that cold cases required different skills, different technologies, and most importantly, different patience. These weren't mysteries that would be solved in weeks or months. They were puzzles that had resisted solution for years, sometimes decades. Rachel Morrison's case was among the first selected for review. 2 MSU graduate students, working under Rothman's supervision, spent weeks digitizing the 19-year-old case file. Every witness statement, every police report, every piece of evidence documentation was scanned and converted into searchable digital formats. They built databases indexing every name, every location, every piece of evidence, creating relationship maps that revealed patterns previous investigators might have missed. The process was painstaking but necessary. Paper files deteriorate over time, handwritten notes become illegible, and crucial details get buried in thousands of pages of accumulated documentation. By converting everything to digital format, they could search for connections across years of investigation, cross-reference names and dates, and build timelines that revealed gaps in the original work. What they discovered buried in the forensic reports was a game changer. Back in 2001, technicians had extracted a partial DNA profile from fibers found on Rachel's denim jacket, the one hanging by her apartment door, the one she'd worn to the hospital that final Friday. The profile showed only 8 genetic markers instead of the 13 required for database comparison. The original report had classified it as insufficient, noting the sample was likely degraded, recommending it be preserved for potential future testing. 19 years later, that future had finally arrived. Detective Rothman submitted the preserved samples to a private forensic laboratory specializing in enhanced DNA extraction techniques. These labs used massively parallel sequencing technology that simply hadn't existed in 2001. Where the original testing had failed to extract usable genetic material, these new methods could isolate DNA from increasingly smaller, more degraded samples. Within 6 weeks, the laboratory called with results that would reshape everything. They'd successfully expanded the profile to 17 genetic markers, more than enough for database comparison. But more significantly, they'd extracted sufficient DNA for something called SNP analysis, single nucleotide polymorphism testing that enabled forensic genetic genealogy. The same technology that had caught the Golden State Killer in 2018 was about to crack Rachel's case. Here's how genetic genealogy works in terms anyone can understand. Traditional DNA testing compares crime scene evidence against known offender databases like CODIS. But genetic genealogy takes a different approach entirely. Instead of looking for direct matches, it identifies distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share small segments of DNA with the unknown suspect. The forensic genealogist working Rachel's case uploaded the DNA profile to GED Match, a public database where millions of people have submitted their genetic information, hoping to learn about their ancestry or find distant relatives. Within days, the system identified several potential matches. People who shared enough genetic material to suggest a common ancestor somewhere in their family trees. What followed was detective work that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. The genealogist began building massive family trees, working backward through marriage records, birth certificates, death certificates, and census data. She traced bloodlines across multiple generations, following genetic threads through decades of American family history. The process required incredible patience and meticulous attention to detail. Each potential relative had to be researched, their family connections mapped, their descendants traced forward through time. False branches had to be eliminated. Adoption records complicated bloodlines. Name changes and geographic relocations created gaps that required creative solutions. But slowly, methodically, the family trees began converging. Different genetic matches, analyzed independently, kept pointing toward the same Michigan family, a family with deep roots in St. Joseph County, a family whose members had lived and worked in the Sturgis area for generations. The breakthrough came when the genealogist identified a common ancestor born in rural Michigan in 1847. From that single individual, she could trace forward through time to identify all of his descendants still living in 2020. The genetic matches suggested that Rachel's unknown assailant was related to this 19th century farmer through multiple family lines. The process narrowed the suspect pool from millions of possibilities to fewer than 20 individuals. But genetic genealogy could only go so far. It could identify potential family members, but it couldn't pinpoint the exact person whose DNA had been found on Rachel's jacket. That required old-fashioned police work. Detective Rothman began the delicate process of investigating each potential suspect. Some could be eliminated immediately. Wrong age, wrong gender, living in different states during 2001. Others required more subtle approaches. Constitutional rights protected citizens from having their DNA collected without probable cause, but law enforcement could collect discarded materials, coffee cups, cigarette butts, napkins, from public places. The work was tedious and often felt invasive. Rothman found himself following people to restaurants, collecting their garbage, documenting their movements, all in hopes of obtaining the DNA sample that would either clear them or confirm their involvement in a 19-year-old murder. 8 potential suspects provided voluntary DNA samples that quickly eliminated them from consideration. 3 others proved impossible to locate or contact, their whereabouts unknown. 2 more were cleared through publicly discarded materials. That left 1 name on Rothman's list. 1 final comparison that would either solve Rachel Morrison's case or leave it unsolved forever. On November 3, 2020, Detective Rothman made the phone call that Marcus Hayes had been waiting 19 years to receive. Hayes was sitting in his kitchen overlooking Lake Michigan, reading the morning news on his tablet when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Retirement had taught him to be protective of his peaceful mornings, and unknown numbers usually meant telemarketers or political campaigns. But something made him pick up on the 4th ring. "Detective Hayes, this is Larry Rothman with the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit." Hayes felt his coffee mug grow heavy in his hands. There was only one reason Rothman would be calling him. "We have a name," Rothman said without preamble. "Rachel Morrison's case. We have a suspect." The words hit Hayes like physical blows. After all these years, after all the sleepless nights and dead-end leads and crushing disappointments, science had finally produced what 19 years of traditional detective work couldn't provide: an answer. "Who?" Hayes managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas Patterson. Do you remember him?" Hayes closed his eyes, and immediately the face materialized in his memory. Tall, friendly, probably mid-40s back in 2001. Thomas Patterson had been a paramedic with Sturgis Hospital's emergency services. Hayes had interviewed him twice during the original investigation. Once as part of the routine canvass of hospital employees who'd worked with Rachel, and again when they were exploring every possible connection to her clinical rotations. But Patterson hadn't just been interviewed. He'd been part of the solution, part of the community response to Rachel's disappearance. "He helped search for her," Hayes said, the words coming out like broken glass. "They always do," Rothman replied, his voice heavy with the weight of too many cases where the killer had hidden in plain sight. Thomas Patterson in November 2020 was 63 years old, retired from Sturgis Hospital after 37 years of service. He lived in the same modest ranch house on Nottawa Street where he'd lived since the 1980s. He was a respected figure in the community, volunteer fire department member, deacon at First Baptist Church, grandfather to 5 children who adored him. This was the man neighbors called when they needed help at 2 a.m. The person who'd shown up for decades at medical emergencies and house fires and car accidents, saving lives, comforting the injured, embodying everything people believed about the goodness of small-town America. But Patterson's involvement in Rachel's case went far deeper than just being a hospital employee who'd been questioned and cleared. In those desperate weeks after Rachel's disappearance, when the community organized search parties to comb through farmland and forests, Thomas Patterson had volunteered. He'd spent his days off trudging through muddy fields and wooded areas, calling Rachel's name, looking for any trace of the missing nursing student. He'd attended the candlelight vigil at St. John's Catholic Church, holding a candle and bowing his head in prayer among hundreds of community members mourning a young woman stolen from their midst. He'd comforted Rachel's parents, offering his professional medical perspective on why someone might disappear, sharing theories about what could have happened. He'd been there for the memorial service when the family finally accepted that Rachel wasn't coming home. He'd signed the condolence book, shaken Robert Morrison's hand, hugged Patricia Morrison while she sobbed about never knowing what happened to her daughter. For 19 years, Thomas Patterson had lived among the people whose lives he'd destroyed. He'd maintained friendships with hospital colleagues who'd worked alongside Rachel. He'd nodded sympathetically whenever her case was mentioned in conversation. He'd even contributed money to the reward fund that Patricia Morrison had established, hoping to encourage tips that might lead to her daughter's discovery. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain that level of deception was staggering. Every Sunday morning, Patterson sat in the same church pew, listening to sermons about morality and redemption and the importance of truth. Every Christmas, he exchanged gifts with family members and friends who trusted him completely. Every time someone mentioned Rachel Morrison's disappearance, he expressed appropriate sadness and concern while knowing exactly what had happened to her. The betrayal went beyond just murder. It was a 19-year performance of false humanity that had fooled everyone who knew him. Think about the people in your own life that you trust without question. Your family doctor, your child's teacher, the paramedic who would respond if you called 911. These are the people we depend on during our most vulnerable moments, the people whose uniforms and titles automatically grant them our confidence. Have you ever experienced that shattering moment when you discovered that someone you trusted completely was hiding something terrible? That betrayal of faith that makes you question your ability to judge character, to trust your instincts about people. Share your story in the comments below, because, unfortunately, Rachel Morrison's case isn't unique. Predators often hide behind the very uniforms and positions that should represent safety and protection. Thomas Patterson had worn the mask of respectability for nearly 2 decades, but DNA technology had finally ripped that mask away. The manhunt was about to begin. November 6, 2020, was a cold Friday morning in Sturgis. Thomas Patterson was in his garage organizing tools for a home repair project when he heard car doors slamming in his driveway. Through the small window, he could see 2 unmarked vehicles and several men in dark coats walking toward his front door. He knew exactly why they were there. Detective Rothman would later describe the moment as one of the most unusual arrests in his career. When Patterson answered the door, his face showed neither surprise nor defiance, just the exhausted relief of someone who'd been carrying an unbearable secret for 19 years. "You found her DNA, didn't you?" Patterson said, before Rothman could speak. "Mr. Patterson, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance of Rachel Morrison." Patterson nodded slowly, then asked if he could put on a coat. The temperature was dropping, and he understood this would be his last morning of freedom for the rest of his life. At the Sturgis Police Department, Patterson waived his right to an attorney. The decision shocked his public defender, who would later argue that his client wasn't thinking clearly, but Patterson insisted he wanted to tell the truth. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he wanted to stop pretending. The confession that followed would haunt everyone who heard it. Patterson explained how he'd noticed Rachel during her clinical rotations at Sturgis Hospital. She was beautiful, dedicated, always friendly to the medical staff. He'd learned her schedule, discovered where she lived, began timing his route home from late-night emergency calls to drive past her apartment building. On the night of March 16, 2001, Patterson had responded to a minor car accident on the outskirts of town. After completing his report, instead of heading home, he drove to Monroe Street. He parked behind Henderson's hardware store, took his medical bag from the ambulance, and climbed those wooden stairs to Rachel's apartment. He knocked on her door just after midnight. When Rachel looked through the peephole, she saw a uniformed paramedic with a medical bag, someone she recognized from the hospital, someone whose presence at her door, even at that late hour, wouldn't have seemed threatening. "I told her there had been an accident involving her parents," Patterson said, his voice emotionless as he described exploiting the deepest fear of any young person living away from home. "I said I needed to transport her to the hospital immediately." Rachel opened the door. What Patterson hadn't anticipated was her reaction when she realized he was lying. Instead of complying with his demands, Rachel had fought back with the fierce determination of someone who understood exactly what was happening to her. She screamed, clawed at his face, tried to reach the phone to call for help. During the struggle, Patterson claimed he'd never intended to kill her. He was attempting to subdue her when she fell, striking her, head on the sharp corner of the coffee table. "The impact was fatal," he said. "She died within minutes, despite his attempts to revive her, using the same medical training that had made him a trusted community member for decades." But what Patterson did next revealed the calculated mind of someone who understood exactly how to manipulate a crime scene. He spent nearly 2 hours in Rachel's apartment, staging the evidence to create the locked room mystery that would baffle investigators for 19 years. He engaged the security chain from inside, then carefully maneuvered her body through the narrow bathroom window, a process that required removing the painted-shut window frame entirely, something a person with Patterson's construction knowledge could accomplish. He washed Rachel's dishes, started the laundry cycle, arranged the scene to look like she'd simply vanished mid-evening rather than been murdered by someone she trusted. Then he carried her body to his ambulance and drove to a location he still refused to reveal. "Where is she, Thomas?" Detective Rothman asked repeatedly throughout the 8-hour interrogation. Her parents deserved to bury their daughter. But Patterson's cooperation ended there. He would admit to killing Rachel Morrison. He would describe the assault, the accident, the cover-up. He would acknowledge the 19 years of lies and deception that followed. But he would not reveal where he'd buried her body. News of Patterson's arrest spread through Sturgis like wildfire. The same coffee shop conversations that had dissected the mystery for nearly 2 decades now struggled to process the impossible truth. The paramedic they'd trusted with their medical emergencies. The church deacon who'd baptized their children. The volunteer who'd searched for Rachel while knowing exactly where she was. At First Baptist Church, Reverend Michael Thompson spent that Sunday morning trying to help his congregation understand how evil could hide behind such a convincing mask of goodness. The pews where Thomas Patterson had sat for 20 years remained empty, as if his presence had somehow contaminated the space. Patricia Morrison, now 74 years old, received the news at her command center bedroom, surrounded by 19 years of accumulated evidence and fading hope. The phone call from Detective Rothman should have brought closure, but instead it brought a new kind of anguish, knowing who had killed her daughter, but still not knowing where Rachel rested. The confession provided answers, but not peace. Justice, but not resolution. Rachel Morrison's body remained lost somewhere in the Michigan countryside, hidden by a man who would take that final secret to his grave. Patricia Morrison sat in the front row of the St. Joseph County Courthouse on August 15, 2021, clutching a worn photograph of Rachel in her nursing scrubs. For 19 years, 4 months, and 29 days, she had waited for this moment. The courtroom was packed with community members who had followed the case since that terrible March morning in 2001. Many of them seeing Thomas Patterson in person for the first time since his arrest. The COVID-19 pandemic had delayed justice by nearly 8 months. Patterson's trial had been postponed multiple times as the legal system struggled to function during lockdowns and safety protocols. But Patricia Morrison, now 75 years old, had waited this long. She could wait a little longer to face the man who destroyed her family. Patterson's defense team had initially planned to fight the charges, arguing that the confession was coerced and that genetic genealogy evidence was unreliable. But as the forensic evidence mounted, not just the DNA match, but fiber analysis, timeline reconstruction, and digital evidence from hospital records showing Patterson's whereabouts that night, they recommended a plea agreement. The negotiated plea was unusual. Patterson would admit guilt to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 40 to 60 years in prison. With good behavior, he would be eligible for parole consideration when he turned 103 years old. Effectively, a life sentence disguised as something more lenient. Judge Margaret Walsh had presided over criminal cases in Southwest Michigan for 15 years. But she would later say that Patricia Morrison's victim impact statement was among the most powerful she'd ever heard. Patricia approached the podium slowly, her husband Robert beside her for support. She had spent weeks preparing her words, writing and rewriting the statement that would finally give voice to nearly 2 decades of anguish. "Mr. Patterson," she began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You didn't just murder my daughter. You murdered our family's future. You stole Rachel's wedding day, her children that will never be born, the grandchildren I will never hold. You took away Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations and all the ordinary moments that make life worth living." She described the 19 years of not knowing, of checking every missing person database, of calling the sheriff's department every Monday morning hoping for news. She talked about the command center in Rachel's bedroom that had become her prison, about the maps and timelines and photographs that covered every wall. "But what hurts most," Patricia continued, "is that you were there. You helped search for her. You comforted us while knowing exactly what you had done. You attended her memorial service and signed the condolence book with the same hands that killed her. That level of deception, that complete lack of human decency, I cannot comprehend it." Patterson sat motionless throughout. The statement, his head bowed, refusing to make eye contact with the woman whose life he had destroyed. Judge Walsh sentenced Patterson to the maximum, 60 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 40 years. At 63 years old, the likelihood of him ever experiencing freedom again was essentially zero. "Mr. Patterson," Judge Walsh said, before pronouncing sentence, "you have robbed this family of closure by refusing to reveal where Rachel's body is located. Your cooperation could have provided some measure of peace to people who have suffered enough. Your silence adds cruelty to an already heinous crime. The search for Rachel's remains continues. The Michigan State Police have used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and volunteer search teams to explore areas where Patterson had access during his years as a paramedic. Farmers throughout St. Joseph County have allowed investigators to search their property. The FBI has provided resources and expertise. But southwestern Michigan contains thousands of acres of farmland, dense forests, and remote locations where a body could remain hidden indefinitely. Patricia Morrison, now in her mid-70s, continues her vigil. The command center in Rachel's bedroom has been partially dismantled, the maps and timelines replaced by thank you cards from community members and law enforcement officers who worked the case. But Rachel's photograph still sits on the desk, and Patricia still hopes that someday she'll be able to bring her daughter home for proper burial. The case of Rachel Morrison serves as a stark reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability, that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who cause the greatest harm. But it also demonstrates the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on victims, and the way advancing technology can finally deliver justice even when traditional investigation methods fail. 23 years after Rachel Morrison disappeared from her locked apartment, her case stands as both a victory and a heartbreak. Thomas Patterson sits in a Michigan prison cell, serving a sentence that will likely keep him behind bars until his death. The mystery that haunted Sturgis for nearly 2 decades has been solved through the marriage of cutting-edge science and old-fashioned detective work. But Rachel is still out there somewhere, buried in an unmarked grave that only Patterson knows. Her parents, now in their late 70s, continue waiting for the phone call that will finally bring their daughter home. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and trust. Thomas Patterson wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was a pillar of the community, someone who responded to medical emergencies, who served his church, who smiled and waved at neighbors for decades while carrying the darkest of secrets. He reminds us that monsters rarely announce themselves with obvious warning signs. They hide behind uniforms and titles and community service, earning our trust before exploiting it in the most devastating ways possible. Sturgis, Michigan was forever changed by Rachel's disappearance and the revelation of who took her life. The illusion of small-town safety was shattered, replaced by a more cautious understanding that evil can live next door, attend the same church, volunteer for the same causes. If this case moved you the way it moved me, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Scenes for more stories that need to be told. Drop a comment below letting me know what case you'd like me to cover next. Your suggestions help shape the content we create together. Some mysteries are solved, but the pain never fully heals. Justice arrived for Rachel Morrison, but peace remains as elusive as her final resting place.